The morning Diana fired Caleb Harris, she called him a dreamer, chasing ghosts in an empty garage. His engine project had consumed 2 years of storage space, 3 junior engineers' weekends, and a budget line she never approved. She signed the termination papers without looking up. Caleb packed his tools in silence, left his keycard on the desk, and walked out carrying a single box of schematics nobody else believed in. 18 months later, that same engine, the one she called dead, sat beneath the hood of the fastest machine ever to cross a finish line. Nobody was laughing anymore. Stay with this story, because what Caleb built in silence will change everything you thought you knew about being underestimated. At 6:30 on a Monday morning, Caleb Harris stood alone in the main workshop of Apex Motorsport Group, and the building around him was still dark. The fluorescent panels above his workstation cast a pale, even light across the metal surface of the bench, and his coffee had gone cold 20 minutes ago without him noticing. He was reading a technical schematic, the way other people read fiction, slowly, deliberately, pausing at certain lines, as if they contained something worth returning to. He had been doing this for 9 years, since before Apex had its name on a race program, since before there was a Diana Voss or a board of directors or a quarterly performance metric with his initials at the bottom. He had been there when the company was a group of investors with a shared conviction and very little else, and he had stayed through every season that followed, not because anyone asked him to, but because the work itself gave him a reason to arrive before anyone else. His workstation told a story to anyone who looked at it carefully. The top drawer held wrenches arranged in ascending order by head diameter. The second drawer held measuring instruments, each one nested in a foam cutout shaped to its body. On the inside panel of his personal locker, not a family photograph or a racing trophy, but a hand-drawn schematic on a piece of paper so old it had turned the color of old newspaper. He had drawn it at 22, sitting in a rented room with a desk lamp and a mechanical pencil, working through a problem he did not yet have the resources to solve. He had kept it for 16 years, not out of sentiment, but because the principle behind it had never been wrong. He was still waiting for the conditions that would let him prove it. Apex Motorsport in those days occupied a strange middle position in professional racing. They had completed 3 full seasons without a championship and without a catastrophe, which in the economics of motorsport amounted to survival rather than success. The new board of directors did not see it that way. They had invested in a winning team, and 3 seasons of adequate performance had exhausted their patience for adequate. They had decided that what the company needed was not better engineers or a longer runway for development. It needed different leadership. They needed someone who could read a balance sheet the way Caleb read a schematic, someone who saw the whole system at once and knew which lines were costing too much. They found that person in Diana Voss, and they brought her in from outside the industry entirely. Caleb knew none of the specifics when the announcement came through the company's internal channel on a Thursday afternoon. He read the message once, noted the name, and went back to his workstation. He had no opinion about leadership changes. He had an opinion about the timing sequence of a fuel injection system and about the thermal behavior of a specific alloy under sustained high-load conditions, and about a project he had been working on in the margins of his official duties for the better part of 2 years. That project was the thing he thought about when he stood at the workbench before the rest of the building woke up. It was the thing he thought about when he drove home late and the highway was empty and his mind had nothing to do but run the numbers again from the beginning. Diana Voss arrived on a Tuesday, and by Friday, the entire culture of the building had shifted in ways that were difficult to name precisely, but impossible to miss. Within 72 hours of her first day, every performance tracking system in the facility had been replaced with a unified software platform that assigned a code number to each engineer and a return on investment projection to each active project. Weekly reporting became mandatory. Budget line items that could not be traced to a sanctioned project code were flagged automatically and escalated to her office. The change was not hostile. It was thorough in the way that a diagnostic scan is thorough, not cruel, just comprehensive and indifferent to what it found. Her background was aerospace, not motorsport, and that distinction mattered in ways that went beyond industry vocabulary. She had spent 20 years in environments where a misplaced decimal point could kill a crew. She had learned that intuition was a luxury, something talented amateurs could afford and serious professionals could not. Every decision she had ever made of consequence had been preceded by data, supported by data, and validated by data afterward. When she arrived at Apex and saw the gap between the company's ambitions and its results, she understood the problem immediately. The team was making decisions on feel, on tradition, on the accumulated opinions of people who had been in the room the longest. She had come to change that. She had no interest in being wrong about it. She noticed Caleb Harris in the first week, not with suspicion, but with the particular attention she gave to people who did not seek attention. He was the kind of engineer who produced no friction in administrative processes, generated no complaints, submitted his expense reports on time, and never spoke in strategic planning meetings. He was also the kind of engineer who would never be able to explain his work to a room full of investors, never build a slide presentation, never translate what he understood into language that could be evaluated from the outside. In her experience, those two things, exceptional technical instinct and an inability to communicate it, almost always went together, and they almost always ended the same way. The first board meeting under her leadership covered the budget in granular detail, line by line. When she reached the heading for internal research and development, she paused at an allocation that had been running for 22 months, without a project code, without a milestone report, and without a deliverable on any timeline she had been given. She looked up from the document and asked the room a single question. What measurable output was this line item producing? The room was quiet. Caleb was not in that meeting. He had not been invited. The project Caleb had been working on did not have an official name inside Apex's systems, because it had never been officially approved. In his personal notes, in the handwriting he used only when he was thinking through something difficult, he called it Project Wraith. The name had come from nowhere in particular. It was simply the word that occurred to him one night when he was trying to describe, to himself alone, the quality he was trying to build into a machine. Something that passed through resistance rather than fighting it. Something that moved faster by taking less from the physics around it. The idea had come to him 2 years earlier, at a race in Nevada, standing at the edge of the pit lane on a day when the heat came off the asphalt in visible waves. He had watched the lead car lose speed not because of tire degradation or aerodynamic drag or a mechanical failure, but because the engine itself was working against its own output at sustained high velocity. It was a problem that every competitive engine in the industry shared, and the industry had accepted it as a fixed condition, a ceiling built into the physics of internal combustion at racing speeds. Every major manufacturer had spent decades trying to get more power into the combustion cycle, rather than asking whether the friction generated inside the engine's own components could be reduced in a way that had never been tried. Caleb had been asking that question in his head since Nevada, and the answer he had arrived at was counterintuitive in the way that most genuinely original ideas are counterintuitive. It required removing something from the system rather than adding to it, redirecting the flow of energy inside the engine in a way that the conventional architecture of the technology actively resisted. 2 engineers had worked alongside him at different points, both younger, both willing at first. The first one left after 3 months with no explanation beyond a reassignment request. The second stayed for 6 months and then asked to be moved to a different team without ever saying directly that he had stopped believing in the project. Caleb did not hold it against either of them. He understood that what he was building could not yet be demonstrated, only described, and that most people found description insufficient. He kept working alone. By the time Diana arrived, the project existed as a prototype engine functional, but not stable enough to run on a competitive track, and as a full set of handwritten notes, data logs from private test runs, and the yellowed paper with the original sketch he carried everywhere he went. He had estimated that 4 more months and a budget equivalent to the cost of repairing 2 standard gearboxes would bring the prototype to a point where it could be tested properly. The number was not large by the standards of professional racing development, but it belonged to no sanctioned budget line, and it had no milestone attached to it that could be expressed in terms a quarterly report would recognize. One afternoon, a junior engineer named Grace Whitfield, one of the few people in the building who still stopped by the back workbench to ask about the project, had posed a question that stayed with Caleb longer than most questions did. She asked why he had never requested a formal presentation slot with the previous leadership. He had been quiet for a long time before answering. What he said was simple. There are things that need to be seen, not heard. She wrote it down in the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket, and she could not have explained, if asked, exactly why she felt it was worth keeping. The escalation happened in stages, the way most slow collapses do, not with a single decisive event, but with a series of small pressures accumulating until something gave way. The first stage was a budget review email that Diana sent 3 weeks after her arrival. It flagged an expense cluster associated with materials that had no project code, no approval chain, and no documented output. The amounts were modest. The absence of documentation was not. Caleb received the email at 7 in the morning and replied the same hour, 4 lines of technical explanation written in the compressed, precise language he used when he was thinking fast. Diana read it twice and understood the vocabulary, but not the purpose. She forwarded it to her operations director with a single note appended. Schedule a meeting. The meeting lasted 22 minutes. Diana sat across from Caleb with the printed budget report between them and asked him to explain the project in terms that a non-technical investor could evaluate. He tried. He drew a diagram on a notepad, sketching the basic principle in the simplest terms he could find. She looked at the diagram for a long time. Then she asked the one question that mattered most to her and least to him. When would the project be ready for competitive testing? He said 4 months, if he had sufficient access to the workshop and the materials already in development. She said 4 months was too short racing seasons. She said the company could not allocate development resources to a timeline that produced nothing testable before the next sponsor review. He did not argue. The meeting ended without resolution, which was, in its own way, a resolution. 2 weeks later, he received a written notice from the Human Resources Department. Not a termination, only a formal caution regarding the use of unapproved resources. He signed the acknowledgement form and returned it the same day. He did not reduce the hours he spent on the project. He did not slow the work. He operated under the reasonable assumption that if the work was good enough, it would eventually be self-evident, and that if it was not self-evident in time, no amount of paperwork could make it so. At a full-team technical meeting 6 weeks after Diana's arrival, she presented the strategic plan for the coming season. Every active project was listed, every engineer's allocation was mapped, every development priority was ranked. Project Wraith was not on the document in any form. Caleb sat at the far end of the conference table and did not ask about it. Grace, sitting 2 seats to his left, watched him through the meeting and waited for a response that never came. When the meeting ended, he gathered his notebook, nodded once toward no one in particular, and left the room. That night, he stayed in the workshop until 2 in the morning, running a series of low-speed measurements on the prototype. The engine performed better than the previous session. He recorded the numbers, turned off the lights, and left through the side door. The morning of the termination began the way all the others had. Caleb arrived at 6:45, filled his cup at the machine near the entrance, opened his laptop, and pulled up the data file from the night before. The numbers on the screen were good. He was midway through annotating them when his phone rang at 9:15. The call was from the Human Resources Coordinator. The voice was level, professional, and neutral, in the way that trained voices become neutral when they are delivering something they have delivered before. She asked if he could come upstairs. He said he would be there in 5 minutes. Diana was already in the room when he arrived, seated to the left of the HR coordinator, a folder open in front of her. She did not look up immediately when he came in, and when she did, her expression was the expression of someone who had made a decision and was not reconsidering it. She told him the company was terminating his employment effective that day. She cited the use of unapproved resources. She cited misalignment with the company's documented strategic priorities. She cited the absence of any measurable deliverable from a project that had consumed company time and materials for nearly 2 years. She was not wrong about the facts of any of it. She was wrong about what those facts meant, but she did not know that yet, and nothing he could have said in that room would have changed it. Caleb read the termination document the way he read everything carefully, completely, without rushing. He found nothing in it that surprised him. He signed at the bottom and pushed the form back across the table. Diana spoke once more before he stood. She said she did not question his work ethic, only the alignment between his approach and the company's operational realities. He looked at her when she said that, held the look for a moment, then nodded once and stood up. He returned to his workstation alone. The workshop was occupied now, mid-morning, people moving between benches and equipment bays, and several of them glanced at him as he retrieved a cardboard box from the storage shelf near his locker. He packed the contents of his workspace, methodically the precision tools that belonged to him, the personal reference books, the notes from his own time. Grace appeared at the far end of the corridor as he was closing the box. She opened her mouth and then did not speak. He walked past her, set his hand briefly on her shoulder without stopping, and continued toward the front entrance. He placed his keycard on the reception desk, not dropped, not thrown, set it down flat, and carried the box through the main doors into the parking lot. He sat in his car for several minutes without starting the engine. Through the windshield, the Apex building caught the late morning sun along its glass facade, and the light moved across the surface in long, slow sheets. He was not thinking about Diana. He was not thinking about the last 9 years. He was running a number in his head that he had calculated the night before, and the number was telling him something he had not expected. He started the car and drove out of the lot without looking back. Owen Marsh called on the 9th day. Caleb had not called anyone in that first week and a half, had not updated his professional profile, had not responded to the 2 recruitment messages that arrived in his inbox from firms whose names he recognized. He had slept, for the first time in longer than he could account for 8 full hours, 2 nights in a row, and the unfamiliarity of it was almost disorienting. Owen's call was brief. He said he had a space in the garage that nobody was using, that it was Caleb's if he wanted it, and that he did not need to explain himself or provide a timeline. Then Owen asked if he wanted a sandwich. Caleb said yes to both. The garage was on the eastern edge of town, in an industrial strip that had been built for light manufacturing decades ago, and had since become a patchwork of small operations, a printing shop, a storage rental facility, 2 auto repair bays, and Owen's place at the end of the row. Owen Marsh ran a one-man workshop fixing private vehicles, motorcycles occasionally, and whatever else people brought to him with the reasonable expectation that he would figure it out. He had no investors, no brand identity, no ambition to grow beyond what he could manage alone, and the floor of his main bay was clean, level, and available. He gave Caleb the back corner and asked for nothing in return. Caleb moved in with a single truckload, a metal bench he had owned since his first apartment, a lighting rig on a rolling stand, and 3 boxes of materials he had acquired on his own time before the termination. He rebuilt the workspace in an afternoon. He ordered the parts he needed through 2 suppliers who had worked with him before on a personal basis, paid for them from his savings, and began at the beginning. Not the beginning of the prototype. He did not have the resources to rebuild that from scratch. He began at the beginning of the idea itself, going back through every page of notes he had accumulated, checking every assumption against the data, looking for the point at which the theory might fail under examination. He found no such point. What he found instead, over the course of 3 months in Owen's back corner, was a refinement, a tighter version of the original insight, a way to solve the timing issue that had caused the prototype to behave inconsistently at high load, not by correcting the symptom, but by restructuring the fundamental relationship between the components that produced it. The yellowed paper lived on the corner of the bench, held flat by a socket wrench. It was not decoration and not nostalgia. It was the record of the first time he had seen the principle clearly, and looking at it kept him oriented to what he was actually building, rather than what the immediate problems of the day suggested he should be doing. Owen brought coffee in the mornings and stayed out of the way otherwise. They had been friends long enough that silence between them required no maintenance, and Owen understood without being told that the questions he would have asked were not the kind Caleb could answer yet. Toward the end of the 3rd month, on a Tuesday afternoon, when the light outside had gone flat and gray, Caleb stopped in the middle of a calculation, looked at the numbers on the page in front of him, crossed out a single value, and replaced it. Then he did not move for a long time. He set down his pencil and looked at the ceiling of the back bay, a corrugated panel 12 feet overhead with 2 skylights letting in the pale autumn light. Owen, passing the doorway with a wrench in his hand, glanced in and kept moving. He had seen enough to know when not to interrupt. Grace Whitfield sent a message on a Thursday afternoon, 4 months after the termination. Not through the Apex system, through the number she had stored in her own phone, from the year she had worked most closely with Caleb on a separate project. The message was 6 words. "Can we meet? I have something." He replied within the hour with a location and a time. They met at a coffee shop near the highway, a functional place without particular character that suited them both. Grace arrived carrying a laptop bag and ordered nothing until she had sat down and looked at him for a moment in the way people do when they are checking whether someone is all right, without wanting to ask directly. Then she opened the bag and slid a drive across the table. She told him what was on it. A full telemetry export from the last 3 sessions. The prototype had been run inside the Apex facility before he left. She had extracted the files the week after the termination and kept them because something told her they mattered, even when she had no framework yet for how. She said she had not told anyone at Apex that she had done it. She said she was not going to. Caleb plugged the drive into his laptop at the table and opened the files without speaking. He worked through the data methodically, the way he always did, moving between columns and graphs without rushing. Grace drank her coffee and did not interrupt him. 7 minutes in, he stopped moving. He looked at a single cluster of values for a long time, then moved back through 3 screens and looked at an earlier cluster. Then he put the laptop aside and said that the engine had been doing something in those final sessions that he had not been able to see in real time. The data confirmed it. The principal was right. He knew, precisely, what adjustment would make it stable. Elijah Monroe came into the conversation indirectly. Grace mentioned him the same evening, at the garage, after she and Caleb had spent 3 hours working through the implications of the data together. She said she knew a driver, not headline famous but respected within the technical community for the quality of feedback he gave on machinery. He was between team contracts for the coming season and had expressed interest in running an independent project if the engineering was serious. She said she trusted him. Caleb said he would meet him once. Elijah drove out to the garage on a Saturday morning. He was a measured person, compact in his physical presence and economical in conversation. He walked around the workbench without touching anything, looked at the partial prototype assembly Caleb had in progress, and asked a question that surprised Caleb slightly by its precision. Not how fast will it go, not how much power does it produce, but what will it feel like to the driver at peak speed compared to a conventional engine? Caleb answered honestly. He said the internal resistance at high velocity would be substantially reduced, which would change the feedback characteristics of the vehicle in a way that most drivers would initially find unfamiliar. He said it would feel smoother than expected, which some drivers found disorienting because they were accustomed to reading engine strain as information. Elijah listened without interrupting, and when Caleb finished, he said, "I want to try it." That was all. The 3 of them, Caleb, Grace, and Elijah, sat around the bench in Owen's garage on a Sunday evening with a regional test event on the calendar in 4 months' time. It was an open-class running day at a desert circuit in the Southwest, sanctioned for independent technical projects, with no corporate sponsorship requirement. Elijah had competed there before under a private registration. The entry process asked no questions about team affiliation. There was no funding, no formal structure, no margin for error. Owen appeared in the doorway during this conversation, listened for 10 minutes without a word, and then withdrew. When Caleb came out later to find him, Owen was locking up the main bay. He asked Caleb directly if he had enough money to finish the build. Caleb was quiet for a moment, and then said not quite. Owen nodded, and told him the amount he could advance without affecting the business. Then he turned off the lights in the front bay and said goodnight. The build took 11 weeks. Grace managed the material sourcing from her end, coordinating deliveries to the garage during hours when she was not at Apex, maintaining a careful separation between her official work and what she was doing in the evenings and on weekends. Caleb worked 7 days without exception, not from urgency but from a settled focus that had been building in him since the morning he sat in the parking lot and felt the quiet after the door closed. The central problem he had identified in the telemetry data, the inconsistent response of the pressure compensation mechanism at high speed, had a solution that required rethinking one component of the system entirely rather than adjusting the component that was showing the symptom. He redesigned it from the principle outward. The result looked simpler than the original, which was usually a good sign. The first test run was arranged at a private facility 2 hours from the garage, a straight test track owned by a retired engineer who rented access by the day without advertising the fact. Elijah arrived at 7 in the morning. The light was horizontal and pale gold across the flat desert ground, and there was no wind. Caleb had been there since 5:30, going through every connection point on the engine and drive system with the systematic attention he applied to everything that mattered. When Elijah climbed into the vehicle, Caleb gave him one instruction: do not push into the upper range in the first 2 passes. Let the system find its own operating rhythm before you ask it for speed. Elijah came back after 2 runs and said the mid-range behavior was unlike anything he had driven. He said at lower and medium speeds, the car communicated differently, quieter in the mechanical sense, more direct in the informational sense. Then he said that when he had pushed briefly above the threshold on the second run, something had become inconsistent. He described it precisely a hesitation in the power delivery that lasted less than a breath but was there and was not there on the way down from the peak. He said it as a report, not a complaint. Caleb connected his laptop to the telemetry output and stood in the open air, reading through the data while Elijah waited. 12 minutes later, he looked up and said, "It is not the engine. It is the pressure compensation valve responding approximately 12 milliseconds slower than the model at that velocity." The solution was not to adjust the valve, it was to change the timing logic of the compensation system itself, so the valve was never asked to respond at a moment when the physics made the response lag inevitable. He said he could have it corrected in 3 weeks. Elijah said, "I will be here when you are ready." An independent technical observer had been present that day, a man who wrote for a trade publication aimed at professional engineers in the motorsport industry. He had heard through a contact that something unusual was being tested and had asked permission to observe from a distance. Caleb had agreed without giving him any details. That evening, the observer wrote in his field notes that he had watched an unsponsored, unlabeled project run a single vehicle on a private track and generate telemetry data that he could not immediately categorize within the frameworks he had used for 17 years. He did not publish the note. He kept it, and he returned to it twice before the season ended. The circuit called Silverstone Desert sat at the edge of a dry lake bed in the southwest, a facility built for endurance testing that had over the years become a venue for lower-profile competitive events. It held a mixed-class running day each October that drew independent builders, developmental projects, and occasional factory teams running experimental configurations they preferred not to publicize. Apex Motorsport entered a car under their standard program. So did 4 other professional teams. Elijah Monroe registered as an independent under a team name that occupied 2 words on the entry list and attracted no attention from anyone who scanned it in the days before the event. Caleb knew Apex would be there. He had seen the entry list when it was published and found Diana's team's name in the standard class without searching for it. He had noted it the way he noted anything that was factual and unalterable, and he had not mentioned it to Grace or Elijah. There was nothing to discuss. He was not there to demonstrate anything to Diana Voss. He was there because the work needed a real surface under it, and this was the real surface available. The night before, he worked in the temporary holding bay, the facility rented to private entries, a corrugated steel structure with 1 overhead bulb and a concrete floor that he had swept 3 times before he was satisfied with its cleanliness. He went through the vehicle with the same attention he always gave to things that were about to be tested against conditions that could not be fully controlled. The adjustment to the pressure compensation system had been implemented and verified across 6 bench runs, each one consistent with the model. The numbers said it was ready. He trusted the numbers. Grace called at 11 that evening. She asked if he needed anything. He said no. Then, after a pause that lasted long enough that she thought the call had disconnected, he said, "Do you remember asking me why I never requested a presentation slot?" She said she did. He said, "Tomorrow is the presentation." He hung up, and she sat for a long time in her car in the parking lot of her apartment building, looking at nothing in particular. Elijah came to the bay at midnight. He let himself in through the side door, which Caleb had left open, and stood looking at the vehicle for a moment, the way he always stood looking at something he was about to trust with his body. Then he said, "I have never raced a machine I did not fully understand." Caleb said, "Do you trust it?" Elijah said, "I trust you, which is close enough." He put his hand flat on the hood for a moment, not dramatically, just the way a person might acknowledge something, and then went back to his accommodation to sleep. Caleb did not sleep immediately. He stood in the bay after Elijah left and looked at the machine under the single overhead light. Then he took the yellowed paper from the inside pocket of his jacket. He had carried it with him every day since the termination and set it on the hood for a moment. He looked at the 22-year-old drawing, the rough lines and the notation in pencil that had been smudged and repressed so many times over the years that some of the numbers had become illegible. The principle was still clear. It had always been clear. He folded the paper carefully, put it back in his pocket, and sat down against the wall with his jacket pulled across his shoulders. The overhead bulb hummed. The dry desert air was still and cold. He was asleep before he knew he was tired. The morning of the running day arrived without ceremony. The sky over the lake bed was already pale when the first haulers pulled into the facility paddock, and the ambient sound of competitive machinery warming up spread across the site in overlapping frequencies, a familiar texture that Caleb had lived inside for his adult life and had not heard from the outside of it for 18 months. Elijah's car sat in its bay with the access panels removed while Caleb completed the final connection checks. Grace arrived at 7:45 and stood at his shoulder, not speaking, watching the last of the pre-run protocol. She handed him coffee when he straightened up. He drank it standing. The entry grid for the open class position vehicles in order of qualifying time, which meant Elijah started from the back of a 14-car field. No one in the paddock was watching the independent entry at the end of the row. The apex vehicle, 3 places from the front, was drawing the attention of the few observers who moved between the bays in the hour before the session. Diana Voss was present in the apex area, speaking with her lead engineer, reviewing data on a tablet that one of her team members held. She did not look toward the back of the grid. Elijah settled into the vehicle, ran through his pre-launch sequence, and held at the line until the signal dropped. Caleb stood at the edge of the pit corridor, with a headset linking him to the onboard radio, a clipboard in one hand, and his eyes on the telemetry display of his laptop propped on the pit wall. When the vehicles cleared the first complex of turns and accelerated onto the long straight that defined this circuit's character, Caleb heard the engine from 200 meters away. It sounded different from the machinery around it, not louder, actually quieter, but with a quality to the sound that suggested something organized happening inside rather than something being forced. Through the first lap, Elijah ran mid-pack without pressing, getting the circuit surface information and the car's balance into his understanding. On the second lap, he began to move. Not dramatically, there was no single moment of overtaking that defined the change. The car was simply faster in the places where being faster required the engine to sustain its output at velocities where other engines began to cost themselves energy internally. By the midpoint of the third lap, Elijah had cleared 4 positions. A timing official at the sector 3 display noticed the number on the independent entry and looked at it twice before recording it. On the 5th lap, Elijah crossed the timing beam on the main straight, and the sector system logged a time that had not been posted at this facility in its competitive history. Not a marginal improvement, a time that sat below the previous record by a margin that would have been attributed to data error if it had appeared only once. It appeared twice, then a third time on the 6th lap, a further fraction lower. The timing officials conferred. The sector records for 3 segments of the circuit had each been revised twice in the same session by the same vehicle. In the apex pit area, Diana's lead engineer saw the display update and crossed the paddock to the timing office. He returned 3 minutes later and handed Diana a printed sheet. She read it standing. She looked up at the circuit, where the vehicles were completing the penultimate lap, and found the number of the entry she was looking at in the line of machines visible at the far end of the straight. She asked her engineer which team the entry belonged to. He checked his registration sheet and told her it was listed as an independent build with a single named engineer. She asked for the name. When he gave it to her, she did not respond immediately. She held the sheet and looked at the circuit for a long time. Elijah brought the vehicle into the pit lane at the conclusion of the session and stopped in front of the bay. He climbed out, removed his helmet, and looked across the roof of the car at Caleb. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The paddock noise continued around them, engines cooling, teams moving equipment, voices calling across the shared space. Grace stood 3 steps behind Caleb, with both hands pressed flat against her sternum, her eyes bright in a way that had nothing to do with the dust the vehicles had raised. Elijah finally nodded, once, directly at Caleb. Caleb nodded back. That was enough for both of them. Diana Voss came to the Independent Bay 40 minutes after the session ended. She came alone, without her engineer, or her operations director, or anyone from her team. She walked with the same deliberate pace she brought to every room she entered, and when she arrived, she found Caleb replacing a side panel on the vehicle, working from the bottom bracket upward. He heard her approach, registered who it was, and continued working. She waited until he had finished the bracket before she spoke. She asked a technical question. Not an apology, not an explanation, a genuine technical question. She asked what specific design choice in the engine produced the performance differential that was most pronounced at high velocity. It was the right question. It was the question that told him she had understood what she had seen on the timing sheets and was trying to understand what she had not yet seen. He set the panel tool down on the ground and explained, briefly and precisely, the core principle behind the pressure compensation redesign and the way it changed the internal energy dynamics of the engine at sustained high speed. He used the same vocabulary he would have used with another engineer. She followed it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I was wrong." She did not expand on it. She did not offer the context that might have framed it as understandable, or the circumstances that might have made it forgivable, or the logic that had produced it. She said 3 words in the plainest form available to her, and Caleb looked at her directly for the first time in the conversation. He nodded. Once. The acknowledgement was complete and required nothing further from either of them. He did not tell her she had been wrong. He did not provide a list of what had been lost in the 18 months between the day she signed the termination form and the day he stood in this paddock. He was not built for that kind of accounting. What he did was straightforward. He told her that the technology he had developed was available for licensing, that it would require a properly equipped laboratory environment and a development timeline measured in seasons rather than quarters, and that any arrangement would need to include a competitive contract for Elijah Monroe and a promotion for Grace Whitfield, whose contribution to the project had been material. Diana looked at him steadily through this, and then said she would need to review the technical documentation. He said he had the complete record from the original development phase and the full data set from the current build, and that she could have access to it that evening if she wanted. Owen had driven out to the circuit that day without being asked, arriving in the early afternoon in his truck and parking in the general access area. He sat in a folding chair near the vehicle entry gate with a thermos of coffee and watched the second session from a distance, reading the timing display on the board visible across the paddock. When Caleb came out to find him after the conversation with Diana, Owen was still in the chair, the thermos balanced on one knee. He asked if it was done. Caleb said the first part was. Owen finished the last of his coffee, screwed the cap back on the thermos, and stood up. He said, "Then I can head back." He walked to his truck, got in, and drove out of the facility lot without ceremony, the way he did everything. Caleb stood beside the vehicle in the bay as the afternoon light went long and amber across the lake bed outside the open doors. The circuit was quieter now, the day's sessions completed, teams breaking down their setups, the sound of the event fading back into the particular silence of a desert facility at the end of a running day. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the yellowed paper for the last time. He looked at it in the fading light, the 22-year-old drawing with its smudged notation and its clear, unchanged principle at the center. He folded it along its familiar creases, carefully, the way he always had. But this time, when he put it away, he placed it inside the flat document case that held the project records not stored separately, not carried alone, but filed alongside the data logs and the engineering notes, as part of the history of something that had been built and tested and confirmed. It was no longer a private conviction in need of protection. It was the beginning of a record, The work had answered for itself, without drama, without appeal. The numbers had never lied. They had simply been waiting for the conditions that would let them speak.